Hello and welcome to AngularAir. For those of you that have been listening to the previous episode about GraphQL and Apollo, we are back quicker than usual this time. Our first week of doing back-to-back episodes, but we have a really exciting one in store for you today. We have panelists Justin Schwartzberger, fresh off hosting the previous episode for Apollo. Welcome, Justin. How are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing good. Made it here in time.
Yeah, you're pulling in overtime checks this week.
Yep. Glad to be here, though.
And then also, we have a new panelist that's on the show this week that was a guest a couple weeks ago, Austin McDiggity McDaniel. Welcome, Austin.
Hi, everybody.
And our special guest today is the esteemed Joe Eames.
Hey, everybody.
So, Joe, our topic for today is going to be Angular 1 to Angular 2 migration. But before we get started with that, there's just one point of contention I wanted you to settle between the panelists here. Austin was on 2 weeks ago. Very funny that he put on a panda mask, right to start off the show, and I laughed and everyone else did. Now after the show, Austin decided that he was going to name himself on Twitter ngPanda. My contention is that you are not allowed to name yourself. You give yourself a nickname.
Right. It's
what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think you got to defer to Seinfeld on that. When George Costanza wanted the nickname of T-Bone, he was working as a construction worker and keeps ordering T-Bones, and then he got the name Coco the monkey. Yeah, I don't think you can give yourself a name like that. You can't pick it. Somebody else, they have to give it to you.
I think Justin gave it to me, actually.
I'm gonna give it to you because I like that ngPanda. So I'll just go ahead and settle it right now and just give him the nickname ngPanda.
For the sake of the community, there needs to be an ngPanda.
Now we have one.
All right, and then actually before we get into the content too, I do want to make sure I mention our main sponsor for today's show. Justin mentioned this in last week's episode, but John Papa and Dan Wallin are giving a 2-week intensive training in Florida, October 6th and 7th. These guys are like two of the best in the industry, two of the best for sure in the Angular community, and when you go to their training, like you walk out of there really knowing your stuff. I've been lucky enough to sit in a number of their trainings, and they just know what they're doing and have a really solid grasp on both entry level, like how to actually get you started, and if you go deep into a lot of these subjects. So if you're thinking about that you want to like go to a conference or anything like that, like those are usually cool and like definitely encourage that. But this would be the type of thing that if you're just starting to learn Angular 2, you should be trying to go to this training. This is like the training to go to. October 6th and 7th, go to ng-learn.com.
And you can't beat that it's in Florida.
That's true, yeah. Fellow resident, Austin, are you going to go to this?
I don't know. John Papa hasn't sent me an invite yet.
Oh, I was waiting to be invited.
You got to retweet that chance to win a ticket.
That's right.
Oh, that's true. You can do that. So definitely follow them on Twitter. You can chance to get a free ticket, but if not, it's well worth the money. All right, so on to today's topic, which is a big one because we are on the precipice of a huge event, the big release for Angular 2, which is coming close, almost inevitable, right, guys?
Yep.
And there's a lot of people out there with Angular 1 apps. A lot of people that have started to migrate, some people that are thinking about it, some people are waiting for the release. And I guess to start off with, Joe, I'd be interested in your background in why you're very passionate about this subject. Obviously, a lot of people are, but I think I've had the deepest discussions with you about the intricacies of migrating existing apps and the approaches and that type of thing. So maybe kind of give us a little bit of background of like what you're doing for your day job, where you kind of run into this on a regular basis.
Sure. So I've been almost full-time a Pluralsight author now for about a year and a half, which means that I spend most of my time trying to do education. But my background, 20 years of software development has been mostly on the bigger app size side of things, right? So I'm really used to big companies with big apps, and when it comes time to, you got code that you want to migrate for one reason or another. And I'm really used to those typical applications where we already got a ton of bad code we don't want anyway. We wish we could rewrite it, and now there's something new. We got to, push towards something new, either a new database, new middle tier, whatever it is, right? That's definitely been my bread and butter in my career. So when I got way into the Angular scene back in like 2009, and now we're coming around to Angular 2, I realized, wow, there's going to be a lot of applications. There are so many applications out there written in Angular 1. And the size of those applications obviously ranges from a couple of hundred lines of code to, we know of code bases that are over 250,000 lines of code. I've worked on one that was well over 100,000 lines of Angular. So there's some really big apps. Now, when you're looking at, I'm an Angular 1 or I'm Angular 2, you got to decide, we're going to rewrite, we're going to leave it alone, or we're going to migrate. And so I kind of had those questions in my mind when Angular 2 started coming around, right? What are we going to do? What are people going to do? How are they going to get around? And the history is very interesting, but to kind of bring it back to why I really care about this, I started looking at what was going on and realizing that there was some really cool capabilities in the migration path, but not necessarily was there a good guide telling people, here's how to get from 1 to 2. And the things that they were telling people to do were actually really problematic. The initial version of the documentation had some really bad advice in it that would have made migrating for any reasonably large size application nearly impossible. So I spent a bunch of time working with the author of the documentation, talking to him about the problems with the approach, working with the other people in the documentation team, and a couple of the guys on the Angular team who specifically dealt with migration to try to work through this. Then I've tried to also talk to people that are doing training. So I've talked with the guys over at ThoughtRoom who do training, and they've actually done some Angular 1 to 2 migration. So I got so interested in this whole thing, I decided to do a Pluralsight course on it. So I've got a Pluralsight course that's like half done. I did the half, which was getting your Angular 1 code ready for Angular 2, right? Which by itself can be a Herculean effort, just getting your code ready. And there's a whole bunch of people out there talking about this sort of thing.
Actually, just on that one topic, I think it's interesting because although there certainly are some people who early on, conceived of the kind of component-based view of your application, and even before .component was available, they started using directives as components. I definitely know some people did that, but the majority of people that I've seen rather had the one big controller for everything, right? That's the typical use case that I've seen.
Yep.
And it seems to me like those are the hard ones to migrate, because you have to essentially break apart your Angular 1 app into pieces before you start migrating to Angular 2. Have you seen the same thing?
Well, I mean, that's only partially true. It is definitely going to be an issue, but you can, if you got those big, huge, nasty 500 to 2,000 line controllers, they can be migrated to Angular 2. They'll be rough. I mean, really rough. It can be done, right? But that comes down to really just about code maintenance. If you've got a big, huge ball of mud and you try to switch it from something to something else, no matter what it is that you're switching, even if you're switching your data access, a big, huge ball of mud is going to be a pain in the butt. So the worse that the code base is, the harder it will be to migrate, simply because it's harder to maintain the code, right? So it's not impossible.
One of the big differences that when I talk to people and they ask about the big difference between 1 and 2, it's page-based architecture goes versus component-based. And I think once you really grab that to build on what you were saying, it really starts to make sense and you can migrate easier.
Right. I think that what we will find out in the long run is a lot of people who have these page-based architectures are going to migrate to Angular 2, and they're going to just have another page-based architecture in Angular 2, right? Fortunately, in the long run, Angular 2 pushes you to a component-based architecture and pushes you to refactor into smaller and smaller pieces. So that doesn't mean that we aren't going to have applications that have huge pieces in them and will forever. In fact, the reality is there's a lot of really big apps where people are going to start migrating and they're never going to finish. They're going to get some of the stuff moved to Angular 2 and they're going to have pieces that just aren't worth it in Angular 1 to move, either because they're too difficult to maintain, it's a feature that's not used enough, or there's just no resources regardless of the other two. Right, but the developers still want to work with Angular 2 on the application, and that's totally possible, right? You can take, in fact, if you've got an app that's all Angular 1 right now, you can leave all the existing code the way that it is and just start building Angular 2 and still have it be part of the same app. There's a few, plumbing things you got to do in there to make that happen. But you can have that and never touch the original code, all that Angular 1 code again. So there's definitely a big mix. But yeah, that page versus component, it's nice that Angular 2 kind of guides you into that component. But I think that we're going to see through migrations that there are going to be people that are going to have a page-based architecture with Angular 2 because they moved an Angular 1 app over.
Well, maybe let's take a step back and talk about the different types of strategies, high-level strategies here, because you actually mentioned a couple of them while you were talking about there between, running, an Angular 1 and Angular 2 app at the same time, going, migrating everything at the same time, whatever. So can you maybe go over like what are the different types of strategies that you're seeing?
Well, obviously from a very high level, you've got three options. Option one is to completely rewrite your app in Angular 2. And that is by far your best option so long as the resources and timeline required to do it are small enough or are big enough compared to the size of the application that it can be done in a very relatively short amount of time. A rewrite like this shouldn't take more than 2 weeks, a month on the very, very outside, because now you've got this application that you cannot touch. So imagine that scenario where we're going to go with the grand rewrite. This is a story as old as software development, right? We got an app, something's new, we want to move it. How do we move it? Well, let's just freeze this one and we're going to rewrite it in the new technology. Well, what happens? What happens is 18 months down the road, you're still rewriting the new app. The old app has been suffering from a lack of resources, but the business can't live without it. So people are still constantly pushing features into the old app. And because you have this new app in mind, the way that you put those features in is garbage. I mean, worse than what you were normally doing already before, right?
Well, right, because mentally, I mean, I've seen this for sure before. Mentally, you're like, hey, this is just like temporary stuff. We're all moving to the new stuff, so why not just hack this to death? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think I've done that to myself a couple of times, maybe.
Right. This is becoming one of my favorite phrase or terms, but it becomes this dumpster fire, right? And you created the dumpster fire, you're throwing all the garbage in, you've lit it all up, and then you climb in and lay down in it, right? That's that scenario. And it's a horrible scenario, so you really should definitely not do that. I think that the good guideline is maybe 10,000 lines of code. If your app is 10,000 lines of code or under, then it's probably okay to do a rewrite. If you've got a decent team size, it could be a little bit bigger, but you get much bigger than that, rewrite's not going to be, especially for an important app. If you can't just take it and shelve it and nobody cares if it ever gets any new features, definitely don't consider this, right? Option two is just to leave it alone. Say it's not worth it to spend time. The application isn't that important. It's fine the way that it is. We're just going to leave it in Angular 1. We're going to continue to add new features in Angular 1. And that's actually a totally viable, a lot more viable than a lot of people give it credit for. Angular 1 is a fantastic technology. The new stuff that's come out in Angular 1.5, there's a lot of performance improvements. Oh, nice. The dumpster fire picture. I love it. I love it.
Wait, I think you're totally valid there. I mean, with Angular 2 taking the spotlight, and React and other frameworks or whatever. Like, definitely Angular 1 gets a bad name, but if you objectively look at what's there, especially even compared to the old days of Angular 1 to what's there with 1.5 and later, I mean, it is a really good framework in itself, and it's simple, and it can be simple. And especially as long as you do things in that component-based way, I mean, we have very big Angular 1 application at GetHuman, and it is a good application. It performs really well. It is easy to add features. So, I mean, it's definitely, that's not, I think some people may discount that as an option because they worry about everybody has to move to Angular 2. But no, I think you're totally right. That is viable. Just, it's not worth migrating. Just keep maintaining it here.
Right.
Plus you have some of that backporting going on right now, right? Or we get some of the Angular 2 features into Angular 1, and so it is a viable solution that you can get some of the new stuff in the old stuff and still keep going in that.
I think one of my biggest problems that I've had, I'm actually upgrading an Angular 1 app, is components that I need are not quite there yet. Whether that's in material, whatever that may be. So it kind of, you kind of extend that projected time frame to migrate by having to build those.
Right. Right. Yep. Another totally big issue with doing the migration. So those are options 1 or 2, right? Rewrite it, leave it alone. Option 3 is to migrate. And by migrate, that's a very specific term that it's almost like its own vernacular when it comes to Angular, right? In this case, specific case, that means that we're going to take the existing app and we're going to slowly convert it to Angular 2. Piece by piece, we're going to move it over to Angular 2. And during that process, what actually happens under the hood is that it's an Angular 1 application that then, for certain pieces, will call and run Angular 2 and tell it, hey, you handle this piece for me. But Angular 1 is like the top level node, right? The top level node in your HTML is owned by Angular 1. So Angular 2 is sort of subservient in a sense to Angular 1 in that case. And
is it possible to do the reverse, actually? I'm not sure if I tried this, but can you have Angular 2 as like the main thing in Angular 1 pieces?
It's probably possible to have an application up and running like that, but to do the migration path, no, because there's a couple of things that go on that's very important when you're running this migration. And that is that you can take any Angular 2 component and you can make that a valid directive in Angular 1 without having to write any, no more code. It's just, hey, utilize this component here in this spot. So if you have like a user info panel and you've got a list of users that's all Angular 1 code, but each item is supposed to be this user info panel. You can migrate that to Angular 2, and then it's called a downgrade, right? That user info panel is still now available within the Angular 1 code base. So you can take Angular 2 components and downgrade them to Angular 1 directives. You can take Angular 2 services and downgrade them to Angular 1 services. So any service that you write in Angular 2 can be usable by an Angular 1 component, a controller, directive, controller, or another service, right? And then you could do the reverse. You can take an Angular 1 directive and you can upgrade it so that it's callable and usable by Angular 2. So you can have an Angular 2 node and it has a repeating list of these user info panels. And if the user info panel is an Angular 1 directive, no problem. It will work just fine. You just have to tell the framework that you're upgrading that, right? But you're not actually rewriting the code in Angular 2. It's still an Angular 1 directive. And the same thing with services. Angular 1 services can be called by Angular 2 components or other services available in the dependency injector for Angular 2. On top of that, there's one other important feature, and that is the change detection is correlated. So if a change happens in Angular 1, the Angular 2 change detection runs. And vice versa, when Angular 2 change detection is triggered, then the Angular 1 change detection will run. There are potentially some bugs in this. I've encountered one that I believe is a bug in this scenario, but for the most part, that works. And so it's another really nice feature. So you cannot do that the opposite way. Having an Angular 2 application with some Angular 1 running inside of it, you don't get that coordination of change detection. And that all happens through the magic of this Angular 2 component called the Angular upgrade is what it's called. The actual name of the code object is the upgrade adapter, right? So it's this magical piece that basically bootstraps and starts up Angular 1, owning whatever the top level node that you pointed at, and then Angular 2 also launches and gets bootstrapped, but it doesn't, the normal Angular 2 bootstrap mode where you tell it, hey, here's my module and here's the top level component, you don't do that. You don't give Angular 2 a top level component. You just tell it, you're up and available, but you're now here you're basically getting told which components belong to you, and Angular 1 is going to go and call over to you and say, all right, I need this component, I need this service, etc. So it acts as a very subservient piece. So that's only possible in the other way, where you have an Angular 1 app and it's Angular 2 running within it, and you slowly move it over.
So what
it actually kind of reminds me of the Angular to React like components that people have developed in the past.
Right. Yeah, kind of a little bit of a similar thing, right? Obviously a lot better tied together, right? But a little bit of a similar thing.
So what you're saying makes a lot of sense. I think the devil's in the details, because it gets tricky. Okay, I'm working on an application, and let's say we say, okay, we're going to maintain this application, but as like new stuff comes up, we'll build an Angular 2 and we'll like have just like you're saying, slowly convert it basically. But the tricky part comes with when you're making in that approach and you're making a change for one set of things. Where do you draw the line? Because it can be very slippery slope of like, okay, I maybe it'll help for this one particular change to migrate over these like 10 services or something like that, or 11 services. Oh, why don't I do more or whatever else? So have you seen that as like a problem of like managing, like do you try to be more aggressive or less aggressive in what you change with any given like iteration?
So my goal with talking to people about migration is to propose and talk about the safest possible path, right? This is you've got a mission critical application with hundreds of thousands of lines of code, and you might, and it's not code that is the best code, right? Maybe there's some brittle, large balls of mud in there somewhere, right? So you've got, and I think that's a realistic scenario, right? We're all used to applications that have code that we're not necessarily as proud of today as we were when they were originally written, or they grew out of necessity into something that now we're like kind of embarrassed by and wish they could be rewritten, right? That's a fairly realistic scenario. And in an important application like that, I want people to be able to make the smallest, safest amount of changes necessary. So that was kind of the crux of what I went through when I was talking with the documentation team on the angular.io site and the Angular team themselves was, hey, the proposed plan that you've got is way too high risk, and any company with architects or lead developers worth their salt will look at this, do some experimentation, and discover this is potentially way too risky. We just can't even risk it. So I helped kind of pioneer together a different set of steps to go through so that it's a much smaller set of changes right up until basically the very end when you have to switch over your routing from 1 to 2. But until that point, it's very small, very specific changes. So in that case, I would highly recommend that you just convert one thing at a time, never more than one thing. So it's either one directive gets upgraded, one service gets upgraded, and then you test, right? You run your unit tests, you run your integration tests, you run your manual tests, make sure everything's working. Right. Yep.
Well, but no, what you're saying is logical from the sense of keeping things safe. But the downside is that can take a longer period of time. So it depends, I guess, on what your ultimate goals, long-term goals are, and like you mentioned, for bigger companies where they have this high-profile app, totally makes sense. Sometimes, for certain environments, it might make sense to be more aggressive, depending.
Yeah, so as long as somebody knows the safest, slowest way to go, then they can start taking bigger steps, right? Like, oh, maybe we'll convert or migrate. I call it upgrade, not upgrade or migrate, because that's kind of the terminology that they use for the existing stuff that stays in place and works both ways. But they convert a larger set, right? We're going to convert these four services, or this page involves these 5 components. We're going to migrate or upgrade them all, convert them all to Angular 2 altogether, and then test. I think the developers are going to have a good feel for how complex the code is, and at what point they're going to want to say, I'm going to take this in a slower step. Because you're not going to get into that. You're going to get into that rabbit hole where, okay, I converted 5 things, it's broken, I fixed that or that problem, and then there's another underlying problem, and I keep fixing, or I get a problem that I just can't even figure out what broke, and now I have to go backwards, unback all my changes out, and then start with a smaller. You only do that a couple of times before you realize oftentimes it's slower to go faster, right? So you got to get that feel, and that a developer's going to have to learn to get that feel, right? I've been converting like a relatively small application from Angular 1 to 2. And even in that, I ended up making fairly small changes and testing because it wasn't too hard to go and test a feature on a small app. And then it let me know that I hadn't screwed anything up. So if I go convert the next piece, that the error I'm seeing doesn't have anything to do with the previous one. And there's enough steps involved in converting any given piece that it's easy to miss them. Like really, it's almost great to have like a list. Okay, if I'm converting a directive and changing it to Angular 2, I've got to do these 7 steps, right? And have that list because it's easy to forget one of them and then get a funny error, right? And there's a lot of complexities that have to do with converting from your TypeScript code down to JavaScript, and now you're ignoring that code, and your Angular 1 is probably just in JavaScript. So now you got all these JavaScript files, and as you rename objects to match the naming scheme of Angular 2, if you don't go around and clean up that old compiled JavaScript code, then it'll still be sitting there on the disk and potentially still get called if you don't clean up the references to it, right? So if you have a control directive, say, that's called like the user panel, and you change it over to an Angular 2 component, you'll probably rename that from userpanel.js to userpanel.component.ts. Well, the old userpanel.js still exists. And if somewhere there's a reference, like in your index.html file, you still got a script tag pointing at it, then the code's still going to be called, and you get these weird errors like, hey, I can't find this, or this isn't working, and you're like, but that's not supposed to be happening, and you just bang your head against the wall, right? There's so many little nuances and complexities to it that you quickly learn the common mistakes, but man, it can be difficult. So I don't imagine a lot of people will do migrations and find that, wow, we can go really fast, we can convert 10 things at a time before we stop and check and see how our work's going. I think most people will find that 1 or 2 is about the max, and they'll stop and check. And there's a lot of places where there's really different paradigms, and so it can be even more difficult, right?
Is there a chance that people might get stuck into a scenario where they say, okay, I'm going to migrate, let's take this on, and it becomes something so big or over time, and their app, maybe as they go through that process, they've got some in Angular 1, some in Angular 2, and it's working and it's functional, that they just settle in and sit with it that way long term and just never go to the finish line? And I mean, is that going to be a concern? Or, I mean, would you say, hey, if you're taking this on, have the desire that you're going to make it to the finish line, or hey, take it on and it's going to be okay if you maybe don't get there?
Right. I think it's totally fine to not get there, right? Like, imagine you're a developer at a company, and it's got this big app, right? And it's important, and they can't rewrite it, and you want to migrate it, and you come up with this plan that says, hey, you don't have to pass off on the idea that we're going to spend $1 million migrating this app. Let's just do a switch over to Angular 2 so that the upgrade adapter is in place. We can start writing Angular 2 components, and that's going to take us, 3 days with testing time, right? All I have to do is get into buy-off on that. And then at that point, you can say, we can still rewrite everything in Angular 1, right? The app's okay. You got this very nice way to get buy-off with your company. And obviously, corporate buy-off matters a lot in projects like this. So if you can't get easier corporate buy-off, you might never get the project off the ground. So that's a really nice thing, is you can get corporate buy-off for, hey, we're going to make a very small change and just enable Angular 2 in our application. We're not going to rewrite anything in Angular 2. And then over time, I'm sure that you guys have been on development teams where you're switching something over, and you have a lot of different strategies for what are we going to do? Are we going to anytime we're going to refactor, maintain or make some changes, add some new features, then we'll rewrite that piece in Angular 2. But other than that, we won't be rewriting. We don't have no master plan where we're going to take specific steps to rewrite Angular 2. That's going to be very common. And I think we're going to see that a lot. So I think we're going to see in 4 years, 5 years down the road, plenty of applications that are still a fair amount of Angular 1 code because that was their strategy. Of course, the strategy might be, hey, we're going to, devote 20% of our resources to rewriting, and the other 80% is adding new features, right? So eventually, we're going to get there. And we don't know exactly how long that'll take, or maybe we make a plan for how long that'll take, but eventually we're going to get there. And of course, some people are going to be like, all right, we're going to put this on a 4-month deadline. We're going to get this whole thing converted within 4 months. And we're going to minimize the amount of new features we put in. We're only going to do bug fixes and super critical features. So that way, by the time that you're done, of course, it's 12 months down the road because nothing ever goes according to plan. But, right, you at least you've at some point converted over. But I don't think there's any problem at all with running the two side by side because it's certainly no worse off than you were with just an Angular 1 application, right? And potentially...
So I was going to say in Angular 2, we talk about tree shaking to minimize, download size and stuff like that. I mean, is running both in parallel, is that going to be a concern, with the amount that you have to download for just client libraries?
Right. So certainly there'll be some additional client libraries, but if you do ahead of time compilation, right, then the Angular 2 client library is already very small. Of course, then you might be adding in, oh, well, now we're going to use, Firebase 2 or this other version, the 2 version of this library. So yeah, that could potentially be a concern. But most, there's only a few libraries that are very specific to the version of Angular, right? At least there's very few Angular 2 specific versions of any library out right now. Ionic, Material, and Firebase, those are the only 3 that I know of that are very specific to Angular 2. So we might see more in the future where you're saying we're going to add Angular 2 and now there's these 10 new components we could bring in, and you have to make that decision at that point. But you still have, at least with your Angular 2 code, you have the option to start doing tree shaking and lazy loading on pieces of that, which doing that in Angular 1 is technically possible, right? But not the most pleasant thing in the world by any means.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Actually, one variation of what you're saying that I'm doing actually at GetHuman is we're actually not touching the UI layer just yet, other than experiments and like some prototypes. Mm-hmm. And most of our migration is with the service level. So we're actually pushing, refactoring our Angular 1 app, trying to push stuff to more of like the service layer. And when you do that, you don't need ng migrate or anything to encompass your things, because you can just author in mostly plain JavaScript for the most part with Angular 2 DI, but then publish it in such a way that, at least with the way we're doing it, that you can get it to publish it so that it works in both. But
interesting.
I think, most people deal with the UI right up front, which requires like the ng migrate thing. Is there performance hits when you are running them both?
So that's definitely a very common question, is what is going to be the performance hit if I'm running Angular 2 and Angular 1 together? So the first thing to understand, one, is that Angular 2 is extremely performant in comparison to Angular 1, right? So much faster, and at least an order of magnitude faster, right? Yep. Sorry. It's at least an order of magnitude faster. So the question then is, if I'm running the 2 together, where's the slow piece? Well, the slow piece is going to be in your Angular 1 code that's already there, right? Adding on a really, really, really fast framework onto your slow framework is not going to make things worse. There's a small amount of overhead between the coordination of the 2, especially when it comes to change detection, but really your slowdown is going to be the fact that I've got some code that's in Angular 1, and that code could be really running really fast, but because it's waiting around for the code in Angular 2 could be running really fast, but because the change detection causes the Angular 1 change detection to fire, then I've got that extra slowdown. So yeah, you've got this potential problem that the Angular 2 code is running slow, but it's not going to be any worse than your already existing Angular 1 code was anyway, right? So you're not making it worse, you're not making it slower.
Yeah, I guess it's just the initial download size would be bigger.
Yep, you've got that. It's going to be a little bit bigger, but again, Angular 2's really pared their framework size down, especially if you use ahead of time compilation. Even if you don't use ahead of time compilation, I don't think that very many people are going to find, oh wow, this was, all of a sudden I've made my app 10 times slower, because Angular 1 is a fairly slow framework anyway. And most people have found that as slow as it still works just fine, right? You can get into some scenarios fairly easily where it really makes things slow and you have to either dig in and tune it or abandon your strategy or something else. But in general, it's just fine. So if you're already at I was running on an application that was a 2 meg download, and you go and you add all the Angular 1 libraries, you're adding less than 1K, right? So you're adding another 5% to your initial download. Sorry, not 1K, 100K, not 1K. So you're adding less than 100K worth of additional code, right? So yeah, you're adding 5% to your initial download. If you're adding 5%, really is your concern the size? The concern is that, wow, Angular 1 made it really hard to break this up and lazy load. If we move to Angular 2, we can start taking that big, huge 2 megabyte initial download, converting it over to Angular 2, and then start utilizing lazy loading, ahead of time compilation, so that code's even smaller than it was anyway. And now you can actually start making performance improvements on your application.
One of the things that I'm doing, Jeff said that he was, just moving the services layer. I'm actually doing the opposite, where I'm just moving the components over. And I'm leveraging all the same, HTTP layers and that type of thing that I have in Angular 1. And I've got great interceptors for error handling and authorization and stuff like that. So I can still leverage all that same code like that. So I'm actually not downloading the whole Angular 2 package. I'm just common and components. So again, your download size is decreased even more by that with tree shaking and things like that.
Interesting. Are you using the upgrade adapter to run the hybrid app, or are you creating a process boundary?
I'm using the upgrade adapter.
Awesome. Oh, what a cool.
So I've got HTTP, Angular 1 HTTP injected into my Angular 2 components, and it works really well like that.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, that's a huge impedance point between Angular 1 and Angular 2 is just converting your HTTP. That by itself, when you're using resource or HTTP. Angular 1's all based on promises, and Angular 2's all based on observables. And that's kind of the real crux of the problem between the two, is the observables and promises. Even though they solve the same problem, they solve them in different ways. And you really start to have to learn RxJS from a lot deeper level than I would hope. I would have thought you would have to learn it, but you got to start learning it really well in order to migrate pieces of Angular 1 to Angular 2, and yet have them work still with other pieces of Angular 1. That could be really problematic.
So Joe, I have a crazy scenario to throw at you. So I have this humongous app, okay, Angular 1 app, and I have no tests, like literally 0 lines of tests.
Right.
I know this is crazy because it's hard to imagine that this would ever actually occur. But let's just
hard.
Let's take an argument. Let's just kind of imagine. Now, one of the keys in doing this kind of piecemeal is, I think, being able to validate that when you move one piece over, that it exists, that it doesn't break anything. So, what is your suggestion in this crazy scenario that there's no existing tests of how you would actually go about safely doing something like that?
Well, you've probably already got an existing process up and running, and I'm certain that obviously that centers around manual tests, right? So if you're already working with the code, assuming this isn't some dead project that all of a sudden, because Angular 2 came out, you're like, hey, that project we haven't touched in 18 months, let's go migrate it. At that point, what's the purpose of migrating? Obviously, that's not a fairly common scenario. The common scenario is we're in the middle of building our Angular 1 code. So we know some pieces really well. We have some other pieces we don't know well. Then we have some pieces that are just plain brittle, right? And if we have 0 automated tests, how are we doing our migration anyway? That's the same, how are you doing our maintenance? That's the same path you're going to take to do the Angular 2 migration, is whatever you're doing for your existing code to make sure that when you add a new feature, you haven't broken anything, or do some maintenance, you haven't broken anything. How do you know? And you're going to just adopt those same methods. So that's what's, in this case, kind of nice, is you don't necessarily have to change anything that you're really doing. You don't have to do all new you don't have to switch over to a whole bunch of end-to-end tests or automated tests. Of course, that would be good, but the likelihood is if you're not doing them now, you're not going to create the priority to do them in the future. So just keep doing what you're doing, keep dealing with the same problems that you're dealing with without the automated tests, but at least your boss is happy because he thinks you're not writing the code twice.
Hey, on this HTTP stuff, is it a real scenario where people are going to run into, do you have to have 2 of those running at the same time, really, when you're talking about Angular 1's HTTP service, and you want to do things like interceptors and stuff like that, and HTTP, and Angular 2 is a little bit different. So do you find people that are you going to say, you should go and change that right away and then make everything else use the one or the other, or are you running them side by side and now have to maintain those things if you're doing this migration with HTTP?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That would be an interesting scenario. You definitely have to do a little bit of investigation to decide what might be best for your project, right? The likelihood is that you're going to be making HTTP calls from enough places that trying to make a wholesale change to them will be very difficult. So running the 2 in parallel is far more likely. We're going to be taking our Angular 1 HTTP with whatever interceptors we've thrown up, and we're going to start implementing basically the same code, duplicating that code for Angular 2 and dealing with it however we deal with it in Angular 2. There's a few other pieces of Angular 1 that aren't dissimilar. For example, you cannot convert pipes. Pipes cannot be migrated. They can't run. You can't have the same exact, in Angular 1 they're called a filter, in Angular 2 they're called a pipe. You can't have the same code base that acts as a pipe in Angular 2 and a filter in Angular 1. It just doesn't work. So if you've got any complex filters, as you go to migrate them or convert them over to Angular 2, you're going to have to duplicate the code and then have these two pieces of code that simultaneously have to be maintained. Fortunately, pipes are a fairly small piece of most Angular 2 applications, so it's usually not going to be a problem. The other piece that is not migratable are decorator directives. So for anybody who's out there and isn't sure what a decorator directive is, Angular has 3 different kinds of directives, and this is actually true of both Angular 2 and Angular 1, although in both cases they don't actually always refer to these types of directives the same, or they don't talk to them about them a lot. So you have your very common, the directives that we're used to writing are component directives, which is it's a directive that has a template and it's represented by some element that I stick somewhere in my HTML. That's a component directive. Those are the ones that we mostly author as programmers. Then you've got decorator directives, which don't have a template and they're represented by an attribute, and they add some kind of new capability to a DOM. We write very few of those on ourselves. We might occasionally write some, but generally we write very few, but we use them a lot. For example, ng-click is a perfect example of decorator directive because it adds new functionality to a DOM node. Now it is able to listen to a click event, right? Or other event listeners are great examples of that. The third type are structural directives, which the good examples are ng-repeat, ng-if. They're directives that manipulate the DOM in a meaningful way by adding and removing nodes. So we have those 3 types of directives. We almost never write structural directives. ng-repeat and ng-if pretty much cover all the scenarios that we deal with, right? So that you almost never have to worry about. Then most of your code is component directives, and those ones convert no problem. You can have an Angular 1 component directive, and this is true whether or not I'm talking a directive that's just a regular old directive with an represented by an element, either a strict attribute set to E, and it has a template, right? Or if you're using the new Angular 1.5 component, which is really just shorthand for creating a component directive, right? It's syntactic sugar. They're exactly the same thing. So whether you're using one or the other, those things migrate easily. You can pick whichever ones you want and you start using them in Angular 2 code. Then you can rewrite them over to Angular 2 and then downgrade them so that they can still be used in Angular 1. The third type, which is those decorator directives, which are just an attribute that you stick on an existing DOM element to give it new functionality, those cannot be upgraded or downgraded. So if you're going to have if you have a lot of those or any complex ones, you have to completely rewrite them in Angular 2. And while they're being used in both frameworks, you have to have both code bases and maintain both pieces. And then eventually, when the original one's no longer used at all by any Angular 1 code, it's only used by Angular 2 code, you can finally delete it and get rid of it.
One other thing that those Angular 1 directives that have all those fancy things that no one seems to know all the different lifecycle hooks, those always don't migrate very well either. That's important to know.
Yep. Quite true. Quite true. And you can easily get into a scenario where you got a directive that does something crazy with Angular 1, and it'll be problematic and difficult to rewrite it in Angular 2. But eventually they both have the same capabilities, so you can figure them out.
So we're getting near the top of the hour, and I have one last question for you, Joe. It's maybe a big question. I don't know. We can, depending, before we get to Pics. So there was 2 years ago now, when Angular 2 was first announced at Angular Connect 2 years ago. I can't believe how much time has gone by. Mm-hmm. But right from the start, they sort of laid out. It's been modified somewhat, but they laid out the at least general approach here that they were going to be rewriting Angular ground up. And at first, actually, the prospects were even more scary than they are today. They had no idea how you would migrate from one to the other.
Right.
And they were just sort of like, yeah, we'll figure it out. And I think in retrospect, there's some probably ways that they presented that information that probably could have been improved. But the reality is that the legitimate thing was trying to make a big leap forward, which is like ultimately the way that they were thinking, right? The difference is, and you could see this difference in another framework, is with Ember actually. So Ember also wanted to make a big leap forward, and they saw what Angular did, and you can argue maybe they didn't get as far as Angular 2 did or whatever, but they did at the very least take a methodical different approach where they said, no, we are not going to just force to do any sort of migration. We're gonna still build for this like far future, but do it incrementally so you can legitimately just keep on upgrading in small updates your existing Ember app to this 2.0 version. So what are your thoughts just in general, like now in retrospect that we're close to the release, and this approach versus like sort of what Ember's approach is? Should it have been done differently? Like, what are your thoughts just in general of like what happened here?
Well, certainly there's a lot of things that were done that could have been done better, right? The way different announcements were made, even the timing of the announcements, so far ahead of the curve when there was nothing to show. There's all kinds of problems. But if it comes down to the judgment call, should they have just made Angular 1 move into and become what Angular 2 is now, or put the new Angular 2 framework? And as Austin says, hindsight is always 20/20. You can look back and see the mistakes. I'm sure that one of the guys on the Angular team that looks at the framework would probably have a better opinion as to, oh, well, we either could have or we couldn't have, right? Like it would be too much of a change. Angular 1 just would never have possibly been, it would never have been possible with Angular 1 to really convert it to Angular 2 or not. Obviously, it's nice. It would be nice if we could just have these forward migrations that have small breaking changes, so that by the time you get to Angular 1.15, it's now what Angular 2 is today. That would be nice. But I think that because of the way that the migration path works, like this is a unique migration path. Mostly you have one of two options. You either have a new version that has some breaking changes. When you convert, you got to go back and fix those breaking changes, and that's it. Or you have an entirely new framework that there is no real migration path. You create some kind of process boundaries, right? And you do some wizardry if you have somebody super crazy smart on your team. But other than that, you're just left with a big rewrite, right? Those are your only real two scenarios. So this is a very unique scenario that you can actually have an application and slowly migrate a piece at a time to the new framework. And I think that's pretty cool, right? So I really like the migration path that we've got today. If I could wave a magic wand and say, hey, I want Angular 1.6 to basically just be Angular 2, but be backwards compatible with, other than maybe a couple of small breaking changes, that would be great. Obviously, that's really not a reality, right? There'd have to be some major changes. Just as an example, I think this is a great example. Angular 1 and ES6 modules, they hate each other the way Trump and Hillary hate each other, right? You've got to make so many changes to use ES6 modules in Angular 1. And today, you want to be looking towards using ES6 modules. Obviously, not a lot of code is written in ES6 modules compared to all the JavaScript code that's been put out there, but the ability to, more easily lazy load and tree shake and just have easier code that works better and be able to start using ES6 and ES7 features, and that ES6 modules are a great thing. We want modules in our code, and Angular 1 hates them. So just the migration path to get Angular 1 so it doesn't hate ES6 modules is already a big thing and going to have some fairly big sweeping breaking changes. I think by the time we were done with that slow, migration process, it would have been fairly similar to just this migration process they've already outlined. So I'm really happy with it. I like the way it is. So my judgment call would be, hindsight being what it is, the path that we've got right now is a pretty good path. The only thing that could be nicer is routing migration. That's the big pain in the butt. When it comes right to the very end, you got to switch over from Angular 1 to Angular 2 routing. That's your big, huge, that's going to be the biggest single unit of work you're going to have to do. So if they had a better way to do that, that would be a nice improvement.
Isn't that
and
coming?
go ahead.
I said, isn't that coming? I've heard talk about a Angular 1 router that employs, the Angular 2 concepts in a future release of Angular 2, actually.
So it'll be interesting if it's like components where, hey, we're going to make it look like it, but the actual migration is no easier than it was the other way, other than maybe some small code changes, right? But do you still have to basically wholesale take every route and convert them to something else and then turn them on and then just hope that your routes now work? And it's not just routes like resolve. People use resolve a lot in Angular 1. And in Angular 2, you can use them, but the documentation is pretty much non-existent. And they're very, very, very difficult to use. And the way that they work together with resolve uses promises and Angular 2 uses observables kind of for resolve, its version of resolve. There's just a lot of work there. So we'll see. The jury's still out on that one. I hope it's much better than it is, but we'll see.
Yeah, we'll definitely have a full show on routing coming up. That's a huge topic in itself.
Right.
So let's get to Pics. We're right at the top of the hour. And Austin, why don't you start off?
TypeScript 2.0 RC was released last week. Everyone should definitely check that out. Some of the bigger things that it really helps address is type acquisition. So no more TSD and typings and things like that. It's kind of all built in now.
Cool.
That's awesome.
Justin, do you have any more picks, or do you use them all up in the last show?
No, I spread them out. So my pick for this show is John Papa posted on his blog an article about introducing Angular modules, the root module. He does a really good job of breaking down the ng module metadata and its properties and what they're used for. So definitely check that out.
Cool, thanks. And Joe, what about you?
So I would definitely like to, I've mentioned it several times, but my course really breaks things down and gives this, 15-step plan for migrating. So obviously that's a really good thing to look at. If you don't want to pay for it, you can go get a free license for a week or so and zip through it. But it only prepares you. The second part where we're actually converting to Angular 2, I won't start recording until Angular 2 releases, and so it'll still be a little bit before that's available. But for a fun pick, I recently binge watched the TV show Stranger Things, and hopefully you've already heard this from other people, but it is an amazing show. Absolutely take some time. It's only like 8 episodes, but it is super awesome. Check it out. Amazing show.
I started watching it this weekend too. It's pretty good so far.
Yeah, it really is. It's super cool. I loved it. Loved every bit of it.
That's awesome. I haven't seen it yet, so I'll definitely put that on my list.
Yeah, check it out on Netflix.
Cool. All right. And just a quick note that before my pick, next week we have the Meta Show, basically a show about creating content, and especially podcasts like this one, but also other stuff. We're going to have Carlos and Lucas on to help us. So that's going to be a great show. Definitely tune in. For my pick, I'm actually picking, it's just something interesting that I saw, that there's somebody who created a PureScript library. PureScript is just a typed JavaScript type language that is built on the premise of trying to do pure functional programming. So no classes, everything functions. And it was interesting that I noticed somebody came out with this idea of generics or proxies or whatever that basically, from what I see, almost exactly look like Angular 2 dependency injection. So because dependencies is a big problem when you get the bigger the app that you have. If you have a huge app, managing your dependencies becomes really hard. And I've always thought that dependency injection is a great solution for that. But in functional programming, although it's great at the small level, as it gets bigger, it gets harder. And so it's just interesting to see these kind of worlds converging in functional programming and implementing something, in my mind, which is just like Angular 2 dependency injection. So I'll put a link for that and check it out. All right, that's it for today. Everyone have a great day, and we'll see you next week. Bye.
Cool.
Says we're still live.
It says we're still live.
Hey, everybody. We're still live. Thanks, Justin.
Extended, yeah. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, this is the cut scenes right here. The bonus DVD section. All right.
All right, see you.
See ya.